So before we get into the meat of this video, I want to clear up that mutualists are not the same as anarcho-capitalists, they're not Nazis, and many of them are indeed leftists.
Geez, what a way to frame the video. Unfortunately, this is not an uncommon insult levied at mutualists from social anarchists. Even more unfortunately, it is questionable re-education really did mutualism any justice in this video. The treatment of mutualists by both communists and capitalists reminds me very much of a quote by Kevin Carson, where he says that in his own polemical career, he has been simultaneously flamed as a worthless commie looter in anarcho-capitalist circles, and as goose-stepping, rand-worshipping racist Nazi in anarchist venues of the Starbucks vandalizing Circle A variety, for expressing essentially the same ideas. In my response, I'll first talk about the framing of mutualism within his video, second, I will be covering his historical overview, and lastly, I will respond to his criticisms of a mutual society in contradistinction to a communist one. To start, he first presents his excuse for depicting mutualists as capitalistic in one of his previous videos.
Anecdotally, almost every mutualist or individualist anarchist that I have met, aside from a very small handful, have been right-leaning. Many of them come out of American libertarianism, or study Austrian economics, or even mingle in Rothbardian nonarchist/anarcho-capitalist circles, if you understand what any of those words mean. That isn't to say that all of them do, but that is what I have seen personally.
Which is not necessarily an invalid concern, but I think it still warrants articulation on how mutualists may use theory not strictly native to the anarchist tradition. The obvious answer to the criticism that mutualists may pull from these circles is probably a so what? It goes without saying that the content of theory is more important from whence it was pulled. There is no shortage of instances where mutualists or people adjacent to the ideology have appropriated capitalist ideas to show their internal contradictions, or even just appropriate it for our own purposes. For instance, Proudhon in 1846 framed his work, The System of Economic Contradictions, as a synthesization of classical political economy and utopian socialism. Hell, even Karl Marx pulled his labor theory of value, used to deconstruct the systemic exploitation of labor, from liberals like David Ricardo and Adam Smith. So, I don't see the cases of appropriation from anarcho-capitalists or Rothbard as particularly damning. Even if I find anarcho-capitalist theory to be pretty shallow, a broken clock is still correct twice a day, and I can appreciate a text such as confiscation and the Homestead Principle, even if I disagree with Rothbard's perspective on the whole. I mean, this criticism could equally apply to social anarchists, as they have appropriated theory from governmentalist Marx for themselves, and just to provide some context why mutualists might pull from Rothbard, it is because the ideology has been mostly inert for the greater part of the 20th century, while in the meantime, libertarian capitalists, such as Rothbard, had been criticizing corporate capitalism from a free market perspective, which, believe it or not, was congruent with the perspectives of the New Left, making it easy to incorporate into an anti-authoritarian socialist framework. Anyhow, I find the intoleration of difference to be petty in an instance of mistaking the map for the terrain. Thankfully, Aaron walks back the claims made in his earlier video, even if not completely, it seems. His intention is admirable even if I think it falls short. As he says,
we're going to be taking a look at the tenets of mutualism, how it was conceived, and some of my criticisms of the idea.
Aaron's historical overview of Proudhon and his revolution is fine, exempting the instances noted which are too superficial, misleading, or inaccurate that demand clarification. He initially states that,
first, they would participate in a revolution that would non-violently dissolve away the bourgeois owner class. All businesses and firms would become collectively owned and operated alongside individual handicraftsmen and farmers. So, essentially, a worker cooperative-based economy.
Although it is true that Proudhon preferred nonviolent revolution, I think leaving it at that paints a picture of Proudhon that's more idealistic than he actually was. For example, he had a hidden insurrectionary streak, outlining a society of adventures, which is supposed to be enacted upon his death, that assassinates political and economic figureheads that are, quote, notoriously depraved or corrupt. A type of propaganda by the deed that really challenges such prejudice. In the general idea of the revolution in the 19th century, which was addressed to the French bourgeoisie, Proudhon constantly hints at revolutionary violence that would happen and be thereby directed towards the government and the bourgeoisie if peaceful change was not endorsed, which shows a more pragmatic and nuanced revolutionary strategy than many communists led on. In regards to Aaron's point on the workplace, Proudhon did indeed want a cooperative-centered economy, but co-ops are not going to represent all businesses and firms. This is due to the mutualist analysis of collective force in the division of labor. which is going to give basis for cooperatives in some instances, but not necessarily in all instances. After all, the cooperatives Proudhon desired would be formed voluntarily, as Proudhon denied the prejudice that organization ought to be formed through the principle of authority. This means that although we can understand the tendencies which would make cooperative enterprise expedient and desirable, it is ultimately up to the laborers to find it fit to associate in such fashions. He makes this note in the general idea that, when I speak of either collective force or of an extreme division of labor as a necessary condition for association, it must be understood from a practical point of view, rather than in a rigorous logical or mathematical sense. Liberty of association being unrestricted, it is evident that if the peasants think well to associate, they will associate, independently of the considerations against it. The collective force referring to the impersonal product created from collective effort. The collective force in Proudhon's analysis was exploited by capitalists, turning the fruits of collective labor against the workers themselves. The advocacy of cooperatives is therefore based on an understanding of collective force in the division of labor, of which would become a socialized benefit under mutualism, making products cheaper for the community. Proudhon's analysis of exploitation leads him to the conclusion that, thus we need not hesitate, for we have no choice. In cases in which production requires great division of labor in a considerable collective force, it is necessary to form an association among the workers in this industry, because without that, they would remain related as subordinates and superiors, and there would ensue two industrial castes of masters and wage workers, which is repugnant to a free and democratic society. As these conditions are absent in lots of lines of work, the practical necessity to organize labor as cooperatives would not be present. Aaron notes that there would be individual handicraftsmen and farmers, but there would most certainly be forms of micro-enterprises operating on an equitable form of wage labor, which was acknowledged by Proudhon. Proudhon is going to say that, I do not consider as falling within the logical class division of labor nor of collective force the innumerable small shops which are found in all trades, and which seem to me to be the preferences of individuals who conduct them, rather than the organic result of the combination of forces. Anybody who is capable of cutting out and sewing up a pair of shoes can get a license, open a shop, and hang out a sign, so-and-so manufacturing shoe merchant, although there may be only himself behind the counter. If a companion who prefers journeyman's wages to running the risk of starting in a business joins with the first, one will call himself the employer, the other the hired man. In fact, they are completely equal and completely free. Some anarchists may find wage labor objectionable at a surface level, but the material conditions for what makes a wage labor repugnant to anarchists in capitalism are absent in the mutualist economy, especially on the scale we're talking about. The actual bargaining power of workers would make any workplace take the character of a de facto cooperative in terms of power relations. In regards to real property, which was Aaron's next bit, the land and buildings would indeed return to their cultivators and occupants as per Proudhon's proposals, which was in contrast to the state socialists and the communists of the time who wanted to either collectivize it under a system of communes or make the state the new landlord, thereby representing common interest. Next he covers Proudhon's proposals for the Bank of the People. Indeed, the Bank of the People would abolish the money monopoly held by the bimetallic standard at the time, where he says,
Next, money would be overhauled, and its tie to precious metals like gold would be removed. Instead, it would be replaced, in part or in whole, by a form of credit that reflected a fixed agreed-upon value for products exchanged within the market. This value would essentially be determined based on the number of hours it takes to produce a certain product, loosely based off of the labor theory of value. Those credits could be exchanged for products or other credits of an equal value instead of a manipulated market value.
The error lies in the idea that the prices of products are going to be artificially fixed at the hours of labor used to make them, which I believe is spawned from the prejudice originating in Marxist polemics. Aaron makes the same mistake later on in the video, saying that,
but in reality, Proudhon proposed that these values should be fixed, rather than fluctuating with the wider market.
Producers may sell their products at any price they wish using mutual money. Proudhon directly opposed fixing prices artificially in the system of economic contradictions, as he states, where there's liberty, production is necessarily undetermined, either in quantity or in quality, so that from the point of view of economic progress, as from that of the relation of consumers, valuation always is an arbitrary matter, and the prices of merchandise will ever fluctuate. Suppose for a moment that all producers should sell at a fixed price. There will be some who, producing at less cost and in better quality, would get much, while others would get nothing. In every way, equilibrium would be destroyed, Do you wish, in order to prevent business stagnation, to limit production strictly to the necessary amount? That would be a violation of liberty, for in depriving me of the power of choice, you condemn me to pay the highest price. You destroy competition, the sole guarantee for cheapness, and encourage smuggling. In this way, to avoid commercial absolutism, you would rush into administrative absolutism. To create equality, you would destroy liberty, which is to deny equality itself. We are not to abolish the idea of value, which is impossible as to abolish labor, but to determine it. We are not to kill individual liberty, but to socialize it. The prices of commodities in actuality are not loosely based on, but totally governed by, the labor theory of value, which states that the long-term prices of reproducible commodities are going to reflect their costs in labor. The costs in labor not necessarily representing wages paid by the capitalists, but the necessary toil and trouble in their production. This is understood by Proudhon as encompassing the qualitative differences in labor, which are the varying hardship, time, and ingenuity necessary to carry out production. The only way Proudhon maintains that value can be determined is by the same basis as the other classical economists, by competition. Competition is necessary to the constitution of value, that is, to the very principle of distribution and consequently to the advent of equality. As long as a product is supplied only by a single manufacturer, its real value remains a mystery, either through the producer's misrepresentation or through his neglect or inability to reduce the cost of production to its utmost limit. This is why the assertion of labor notes by Marx doesn't make sense in the context of Proudhon's economic analysis and proposals. Proudhon doesn't consider time to be synonymous with labor. It is at best only a convenient measuring stick empirically, as Proudhon really saw labor as a quite indeterminate thing in and of itself, which is only made real through its product. He says that, by a sort of ellipsis, we say the value of labor, we make an enjambment which is not at all contrary to the rules of language, by which theorists ought to guard against mistaking for a reality. Labor, like liberty, love, ambition, genius, is a thing vague and indeterminate in its nature, but qualitatively defined by its object. That is, it becomes a reality through its product. When therefore we say, this man's labor is worth 5 francs per day, it is as if we should say, the daily product of this man's labor is worth 5 francs. On that note, I think from these passages that I have shown Proudhon does not advocate for the artificial fixing of prices in the mutualist economy. On the basis of this misconception, re-education then furthers the idea that Proudhon's mutual bank would issue receipts of fixed equivalents.
In reality, under Proudhon's system of exchange and People's Bank, receipts would be given for products guaranteed by current value, thereby realizing an exchange for an equivalent amount of labor. In other words, there would be a set price for any good in the market that would be agreed upon by the producers and consumers based on the labor put into each product.
In reality, prices are not fixed, and the circulating medium for the People's Bank were not receipts, but banknotes issued by said Bank of the People. These notes would not be issued explicitly according to the amount of labor. Notes would be issued against wealth and security that workers possessed, and may or may not be exchanged at their full value depending on the type of security in the transaction. Re-education is pretty slippery with his recount of this, as in certain parts of the video he talks about Proudhon wanting labor credits, while earlier in the video he talks about actual cash being issued by the People's Bank.
Primarily, these collective banks would take the goods produced by the workers as collateral in exchange for cash or credit of an equal value, allowing for market exchange.
So, to be clear, Proudhon does not propose any system of labor-based currency, labor notes, labor credits, or anything of the sort, which means that Proudhon is one of the mutualists that re-education is later exempting from his overview of Proudhon.
Of course, some mutualists today don't necessarily use labor credits, and they prefer to actually just use regular money or dollar bills, currency, dough, dollar bills, y'all.
This cannot be stressed enough because this is a really common misconception. Proudhon did not advocate for, and his Bank of the People would not have used, labor credits. According to Aaron, Proudhon's ideas were restricted to small-scale economies, which is not true. He states that,
essentially, much of his ideas were supposed to be focused on a very narrow range in small community interactions rather than on a macroeconomic scale.
According to Ian McKay, an anarchist researcher, an opposition to large-scale industry is a recurring error in the secondary literature, which I think is the basis for this error. What Proudhon was really opposed to was the subordination of workers to the industrial capitalists, exploiting workers and treating them as mere tools of production, which his analysis of collective force and the division of labor are going to explain. He did not neglect large industries as he advocated for their organization as federated cooperatives, or as he called them, workers' associations. Workers' associations in the industries at large could then federate under mutualism into larger networks to furnish common interests and needs. Later, he makes a similar error, implying that the notes employed by the banks would only circulate on a small scale.
The credits exchanged would only circulate in a very narrow range of mutually independent producers within a small collaborative market.
This is not true, as the notes issued by mutual banks would face broader circulation. The initial proposal of Proudhon for the mutual bank was itself a reform of the National Bank of France. He was not confined to small-scale thinking at all. As we can see, Proudhon illustrate the scaling that mutual banking can achieve. Suppose the Bank of Exchange to start at first on a basis of 1,000 subscribers instead of 100,000. The amount of paper it would issue would be in proportion to the business of these 1,000 subscribers, and negotiable only among themselves. Afterwards, according as other persons should adhere to the bank, the proportion of bills would be as 5,000, 10,000, 50,000, etc. And their circulation would grow with the number of subscribers as a money peculiar to them. Then, when the whole of France should have adhered to the statutes of the new bank, the issue of paper would be equal at every instant to the totality of circulating values. We will also see later in this video that mutual banking will have an international impact on foreign trade, showing again the vastness of his ideas and their impacts. Then, Aaron makes a point to illustrate that Proudhon's ideas are now decrepit.
Now, this made a whole lot of sense almost 190 years ago when it was first proposed. Industrial capitalism in the form of the Industrial Revolution was still in its infancy, and many of the values professed by classical liberals still had a large overlap with leftist ideas.
And he repeats this point later in his video when he says,
"If we take Proudhon's mutualist ideas to their logical conclusions, which again I don't think we are necessarily meant to do,"
effectively saying that although Proudhon's mutualism can be appreciated as an artifact of history, it shouldn't be taken seriously in the modern day. Although he does not tell us what specifically makes them outdated, that is for the viewers to determine. I also have a feeling re-education doesn't understand what taking Proudhon's ideas to their logical conclusion would actually entail, judging by the video. In Proudhon's specific credit proposals, like the Bank of Exchange, which was a reformation of the National Bank of France, and the Bank of the People, which was a popular outline of mutual banking to fit the needs of the Parisian working class, the underlying principles that inform mutual banking are going to be just as applicable in the modern age. Proudhon's theories on money and credit, the analysis of property, his social science, and his ideas on mutuality are all still going to be usable by neo-mutualists in the modern context. For example, William Batchelor Greene adapted Proudhon's ideas on credit for the land-rich, money-poor New Englanders, exemplifying how the same underlying principles of Proudhon's project are plastic to local constraints and needs. This adaptability is going to be emphasized a ton by neo-Proudhonians of the modern day. Even so, there's a hint of truth to the claim, and that is that Proudhon was not a system builder. He gives us an important note of how we should embrace his work here. "Do not expect me to give you a system. My system is progress, the necessity of working ceaselessly to discover the unknown, bit by bit, as the past is exhausted. Next year, that aspect, the most important of our work, will be brought to light in a manner to quickly seize minds. Then one will understand that free credit and other formulas are for us only the first step out of the past, but that the future in its fullness evades us, that it is hardly possible to imagine it except through a symbol, more or less mythical, that I call anarchy, as others call it fraternity." Another important point to go over is Aaron's account of property theft, which I think is important to rectify for popular audiences.
There's also a lot of misconceptions regarding Proudhon's position on property. As he famously stated, property is theft. Somewhat in contradiction to this statement, he was also quoted in saying property is freedom. But all of this has to do with how Proudhon defined property. It's commonly believed that Proudhon was describing land monopolies and royal domain when he spoke about property being theft, and individual or collective ownership of property when he talked about it being freedom.
The idea that Proudhon was talking about different forms of property when he wrote property is theft and property is liberty is a common misconception. Maybe the meaning of property theft and property liberty given are commonly believed, but they are also incorrect. So what is truly going on here? To give a better account, Proudhon, when writing to Pierre Leroux in his second memoir, specified that his use of the term property and likewise possession are based on Roman and civil law. Proudhon presents the Roman law's definition of property as the right to use and abuse one's own within the limits of the law. The abuses are being equated to property itself by Proudhon. In response to Jérôme Adolphe Blanqui, he expands on its use of the term, as he states that Blanqui acknowledges that property is abused in many harmful ways. I call property the sum of these abuses exclusively. Proudhon then describes these abuses as edges of a polygon, which, when knocked off, leave behind a circle, the circle being an entirely new thing compared to its parent. We may call this property only in the sense that we may recycle old words to give meaning to new ideas. But this is what Proudhon fundamentally gets at in the book when he maintains that we must abolish property. Proudhon gives his most succinct account of his use of property in its relation to robbery in Chapter 5 of What is Property, as he identifies a host of abuses that are linked to robbery etymologically. From the right of the strongest springs the exploitation of man by man, or bondage, usury, or the tribute levied upon the conquered by the conqueror, and the whole numerous family of taxes, duties, monarchical prerogatives, house rents, farm rents, etc., in one word, property. One of the passages I like to refer to when dealing with this is Stephen Pearl Andrews' review of What is Property when it first became translated into English. He gives a brief overview that encapsulates what Proudhon was getting at in down-to-earth language. What Proudhon means by property is that subtle fiction which makes that mine or thine of which we are out of possession, for which we have no present use, but which by the subtle tie we may recall at our option, using it in the meantime to subjugate others to our service, by taking increase for its use in the form of rent, interest, and the like. He uses the term property, therefore, in a very rigorous and technical sense, and unless this is constantly borne in mind, he is certain to be misunderstood, and the truth of which he is representing will be lost sight of. Possession, he says, is a right. Property is against right. So, how can property simultaneously be freedom? In this sense, Proudhon is distinguishing between the aims of property and its effects. He is indeed speaking of the same property as defined by Roman law, which he clarifies himself in his Confessions of a Revolutionary. In the System of Economic Contradictions, after having recalled and confirmed my first definition, I added one entirely contrary, but based on consideration of another order, which could neither destroy nor be destroyed by the first argument. Property is liberty, property is theft, property is liberty. These two propositions are equally demonstrated and subsist side by side in the system of contradictions. I also did the same for each of the economic categories, the division of labor, competition, the state, credit, the community, etc., showing in turn how each of these ideas, and consequently how these institutions they generate, have a positive and a negative side, how they give rise to a double series of diametrically opposed results. Hopefully this gives viewers a better understanding of why property is theft and how it can simultaneously be freedom.
This is a distinction somewhat similar to the private versus personal property argument that many future anarchists made, but it's not exactly the same.
Although the definitions of private and personal property are plastic to the ideological framework that uses it, it is largely true that many anarchists define private property as the ownership of objects to exploit others, while personal property is ownership for use, both of which are elaborated on in an anarchist FAQ. With that, to avoid confusion, we should acknowledge that individualist anarchism doesn't use this distinction, and instead it uses the term private property in the sense that it designates exclusive ownership by private individuals. Re-Education now engages in this section criticizing mutualists, which I believe can be best summed up as a meager attempt to apply mutualism is ableist in that production for exchange will naturally lead back to both a government state and capitalism. Before engaging with the criticisms, it should be made mention that although all mutualists don't preclude markets, mutualism itself isn't necessarily a market system to be enacted. Some mutualists particularly embrace anti-capitalist markets, while other mutualists' projects that are based on Proudhon's social science look more akin to an especially anarchistic anarchism without adjectives. For reference, I take inspiration from both the freed market anti-capitalism strain championed by American individualists, as well as the resurgence of Proudhon's social science embraced by the Neo-Proudhonian strain. Either way, Re-Education's polemics against markets in an anarchist society aren't satisfactory. He has stated that he wants to focus on Proudhon, and my response will be defending Proudhon, but also mutualism as a whole. To start his critical section, he pulls a quote from Kropotkin's Conquest of Bread criticizing collectivist anarchists. Obviously, this doesn't work in the context of mutualism, because his pleas were against the collectivists. who advocated that the means of production are held in common by the community and advocated for the labor note system, while mutualists as a rule do not advocate for labor checks. Although Kropotkin's argument doesn't really work in this context, from my understanding we can infer these three main points from the quoted sections by Kropotkin. Firstly, mutualists only make capital less offensive. Secondly, mutualists retain private property and individual ownership. And thirdly, any circulating medium can be leveraged as rent. I'm not going to defend the English socialists, but the criticism Kropotkin levies at Proudhon is devoid of any substance, which makes sense since this paragraph is talking down to the collectivists and not to the mutualists. Either way, the character of capital is necessarily abolished if the exploitation of labor ceases. This is even a point that communists such as Marx and Engels made, which Aaron said the former had
also seemed to take a more broad and realistic view of the entire market
than Proudhon, which I would seriously dispute, by the way. Marx put simply that capital perishes if it does not exploit labor power, which in order to exploit it must buy. Capital, in this sense, being to turn a profit from labor through the ownership of the means of production, and Engels reaffirms this point when he says that to produce commodities does not impart to the instrument the character of capital. The production of commodities is one of the preconditions for the existence of capital, but so long as the producer sells only what he himself produces, he is not a capitalist. He only becomes so from the moment he makes use of his instrument to exploit the wage labor of others. So Proudhon did indeed make capital less offensive, in the sense that he advocated its general abolition in the technical Marxist sense. Although we may say so in the strictest sense of the term capital, mutualists such as myself will use capital in a less rigorous fashion as to denote the instruments or inputs of production. Otherwise, there isn't much to respond to in this case. For Kropotkin's second point, Proudhon did advocate for individual ownership in private property, depending on how you define the latter. I think individual ownership is important for a free society, but since there isn't a direct criticism to respond to, I likewise can't make a proper response. The last point related to Kropotkin is that any circulating medium can be accepted as forms of unearned rent by landlords or capitalists. Since as anarchists we understand that rentier classes such as these depend on privileges and monopolies grantable only through authority, I don't see this as problematic. It is essentially stating that currency is one of the necessary preconditions for the exploitation of labor. Which, sure, maybe, but that is far from saying that currency necessarily entails exploitation, since Reeducation ends his video maintaining that
credit, currency, private property, banking systems, and free markets are not necessarily capitalistic in and of themselves, but hold many of the same contradictions as they do within the capitalist system.
I fail to see the problem in and of itself, as the points by Kropotkin quoted from The Conquest of Bread that may apply to mutualists ultimately must rest on further argumentation. On that note, I am very disappointed in the discussion of value theory in Reeducation's video. This is mainly because I think it indicates a lack of care when making a video on the subject, as he poses some questions with some very obvious answers. The answer to how the qualitative differences in labor affect the exchange value of its product has already been incorporated in Proudhon's theory of value, and thus doesn't warrant significant consideration, as the prices that represent labor are a natural tendency in the free exchange of products. He then poses this challenge to mutualists.
And how exactly do we remunerate people for different levels of skill? Should the journeyman's labor be worth the same amount as the apprentice? Should the doctor be paid the same as the store clerk? And what of the garbage man, the sewage plant worker, paramedics, or firefighters? Surely someone who is endangering their health, safety, or quality of life is worth more in an hour than a student, artist, or farmer. Or are they? How can we determine these values? How can someone determine another man's worth? This doesn't sound very anarchistic, not very libertarian at all.
This line of questioning, I think, presupposes that prices would be fixed and artificially regulated, which we have disposed of before. For mutualists, the fair and natural wage being used to designate the remuneration of labor, is its full unadulterated product. Likewise, the natural exchange value for a product is going to be its relative difficulty or repugnance of the necessary labor involved in its creation. The economic jargon for such is the labor's necessary disutility. This is continually self-regulated by the organic higgling and bargaining by producers and consumers under free competition. More repugnant occupations would thus command higher remuneration, the same with labor requiring the exercise of more skill or dexterity. Likewise, as technology advances and less labor is needed to produce a commodity, its price will cheapen over time to reflect the less amount of labor necessary. Remuneration for a job equally laborious would be the same in this case, only more would be produced by an equal amount of toil, and more, better, and cheaper products could be enjoyed in turn. Is this not equitable? How to fill unattractive occupations has been notoriously difficult for communist anarchists to answer, and when it is answered, it generally results in an informal version of the collectivist wage system which we have just seen Kropotkin criticize. Yet when we admit exchanges into our anarchist project, unattractive work becomes incentivized and equivalence reached. It is not that some entity determines another man's worth. Producers judge whether their own line of work is worthy of pursuit, and if consumers find their product valuable or of some use, enough to cover the necessary costs, then they will support its production. Put shortly, it is a system of mutual guarantees for producers, exchanging labor for labor on each of their own terms. It is hard to get more anarchist than that. Though, this doesn't seem to be enough for re-education, as he criticizes mutualists because he seems to expect that all markets will work fundamentally the same, with the same set of problems. The issue that he finds is that the exchanging of products for products rewards occupations differently, and that people might work jobs they don't want to do. For example,
should a poet forego her poetry because it's more lucrative to produce pins in a factory? Should a road worker be compelled to forego their daily cup of coffee so they might afford to feed their family? In other words, should those in society that do the jobs deemed less worthy be denied the pleasures of life itself? Should they be satisfied with drudgery in place of fulfillment? Should they be content with their lot?
The poet should not forgo anything if they do not wish to, as everyone is free to make personal decisions on the application of their time and effort. Although the worker who wants to put in the extra effort and perform more repugnant labor would be compensated for their troubles. Horrible, isn't it, that labor be paid? What is really underlying this criticism is the assumption that toilers wouldn't have the access to wealth to pursue occupations they would find desirable, which is false. Workers receiving their full product, not having to pay rent or taxes, and having to work fewer and fewer hours would be in a much more comfortable position to engage in intellectual and artistic pursuits. Believe it or not, the road worker could drink coffee and feed their families under mutualism. This is an example of how machinery and technology are going to open up more opportunities for workers in contrast to capitalism. Capital being at the command of labor without exploitation, machinery is going to work for labor rather than against it. Labor is going to be more productive with the aid of machinery and automation, and therefore has more ability to rest with the same level of production, which allows producers to move to other pursuits as fewer laborers are needed to fulfill demand. Innovations in machinery would cheapen products as average prices adjust with the diminishing labor necessary for their production. The benefits would thus be socialized as cheaper commodities become enjoyed as a benefit for the community. Likewise would be the case with the division of labor, innovations in technique, and the application of collective force. Point being, a mutualist economy would have a tendency to expand opportunities for laborers rather than confine them. Again, since an object must offer some utility or some use for it to command value, and hence be exchanged for other products, people will support each other if their toils mutually benefit each other, such is the point of free association. This is a point that Kropotkin acknowledged in The Conquest of Bread, when he pointed out that when laborers associate, there will be some contract and some necessity for most people to commit some hours a day towards socially necessary labor. Just as in the case under communism, under mutualism, there's no authority compelling anyone to do anything. Under anarchism, opportunity will be free to pursue. Probably the strangest position I think communist anarchists hold is the embrace of the subjective theory of value, correctly explained by the horseshoe theory. Okay, but for real, re-education makes a few points in this regard.
How are we to measure the value of someone's work, or of the goods they produce? Things don't only have a labor value, they also have a use value, a need value, a want value, a sentimental value, and 100 other forms of value that you can place on an object.
I already presented a dumbed-down version of how the labor theory of value operates naturally and shows that free competition adjusts the long-term exchange value of goods towards their costs and labor. I believe the point on a supposed 100 other forms of value to be a matter of sophistry, which is not uncommon in debates around value theory. The ability to define different forms of wants as particular values is devoid of any substance. Although people do need, want, or hold sentiments very individual to themselves, this doesn't engage with the substance of how mutualists use the labor theory of value, and hence loses all meaning in relation to such a discussion. What mutualists maintain is that the basis of exchange is on the labor necessary for a commodity, that there is no fair basis for the exchange value of products other than the labor that is necessary to make them, which would give the producer the ability to purchase an equivalent of their own labor. People would be exchanging labor for labor, pain for pain, burden for burden, all for the satisfaction of their wants and desires. The beauty is that it requires no artificial enactment. Equity naturally arises from the voluntary association and exchanges of free individuals and their toils. Re-education then repeats a pretty bog-standard capitalist argument for the subjective theory.
A bottle of water to the man dying of thirst is going to be worth everything, but be virtually worthless to someone who is standing next to a spring. And this doesn't even consider the value that can be artificially created through marketing, making a consumer believe that they need a product that is otherwise unnecessary or useless to them.
Which no one would of course deny, although in regards to the broader economy this point is pretty worthless. When we talk descriptively of exchange value, a guy dying of thirst can stumble into a Taco Bell, and no matter how much the guy wants the sweet nectar of Mountain Dew Baja Blast, the guy obtains it at the same price as any other. I would assume both Aaron and I would object to leveraging bargaining power to extract wealth from someone in dire need. Such would be civilized cannibalism, and that is what free competition secures against. It assures the tendency that products will be sold according to their necessary labor in production, as cheaply as possible, and therefore equity will be assured to both producers and consumers. The obvious question in response is to ask, what of the people in dire need, such as those who are starving or dying of thirst and have nothing to exchange for their basic needs? What then? The answer is that people in the community should offer this person gratuitous support, just like that in a communist society, and over time the preponderance of such cases would diminish. If this person cannot receive support, they should steal food and drink. On the subject of advertising, I see no substantial issue presented for a mutualist economy. Advertisement allows consumers to find products they may already want, and could likewise induce demand for a new commodity that they may want to try. I am in accord with Aaron when I say that individuals themselves are the best judge of their own wants and desires, which is a point that he makes a little bit later.
You might think that a pack of smokes or a Baby Yoda plushie is a waste of money, and I might agree with you, but that may be the only thing that brings joy to that person's life.
Whether we find it personally errant for an individual to trade for a pack of ciggies, I think it is not our place to judge for them what they should think is valuable, provided their wants don't lead them to violate or limit the freedoms of others, of course. If the issue with advertisement is that it induces a demand where there may not be one already, I find this criticism to be devoid of any substance as well. After all, there is no demand for new innovations, as by definition they haven't existed before. This information needs to be communicated somehow, and this communication is advertisement. There's no reason for me not to believe that advertisements would not exist in a communistic society, to deliver similar information to attract popular support for production. I think the negative attributes to advertisement would largely be done away with in a mutualist economy as cultural attitudes shift. Ads are largely reflective of culture, and a culture valuing equity and cost price would likely find disingenuous advertisement to be a lesser form of swindlery. I admit I don't have much to base this point on, but non-coercive advertisement is not a significant issue either way. Probably re-education's biggest series of arguments in this video is going to revolve around the idea that people would be directly remunerated for labor in the mutualist economy with currency. His main point is that it neglects people who are incapable of work.
Following Marx's criticism, if you received vouchers based on the number of hours of work you perform, then those who are able to do the most hours get the most benefit. That is obviously more fair than our current system, but negates to consider those of us who are unable to work long hours or at all. For instance, elderly, sick, or disabled people. Now obviously, there can be measures put in place to rectify this problem, such as a mutual agreement of some sort to support the elderly or the sick. But that means that certain people are given labor credits without performing any labor. In other words, charity, charity, charity. Or welfare, as we commonly call it today.
Again, mutualists don't propose labor credits. It is also incorrect to presume that in a mutualist economy we would necessarily work long hours. The impetus for such is lacking. In a capitalist economy with the intermediary of the wage system which works to profit capitalists, production becomes diverted towards the accumulation of wealth rather than the fulfillment of needs. In contrast, in a mutualist economy, production would be primarily for use and wealth would have a tendency to circulate. Capital becomes at the command of labor rather than a privileged idling class, bullshit and unnecessary jobs would diminish, more opportunities would spawn for labor to take advantage of, and working hours would shorten. Of course, if someone wants to work hard, then they are still free to do so, but the necessity for such will diminish under mutualism. As for the disabled and the sick, he is correct to say that in a mutualist society there would most definitely develop a system of mutual guarantees that the absolutely destitute could get support from. The new economy would also feature expanded opportunities for what we consider disabled people to contribute in ways alien to what is currently rewarded in the status quo. As for the elderly, the abolition of usury alone would allow workers to retire earlier with larger stocks of wealth saved up. Curiously, re-education doesn't provide how communists would deal with the issue, or even doesn't seem to think it is an issue for communists, instead presents it as a problem specifically mutualists have to deal with, which I find a bit funny, because Kropotkin in Chapter 12, Section 3 of The Conquest of Bread bases the association of groups under the same sorts of principles that Aaron is criticizing in a commercialist anarchism. Groups would make contracts with people for labor in exchange to access for their wealth, each at equal liberty to agree or decline the exchange, meaning that the access to wealth for the disabled is equally at the caprice of producers. For communism to really be voluntary, producers would have to be at liberty to associate, or not, which means ultimately, in communism, the disabled are still at the mercy of the producers. Still, the methods communists would use to support these groups are the same endorsed by mutualists, as we will soon see. Still, Aaron goes forth to make some pretty silly conclusions based on this.
And in an economy centered around production, how do we determine how much someone is worth if they are unproductive? Considering the needs of each individual or family is going to be vastly different from one another, how do we solve this without creating a disparity, or even a hierarchy? How much is a mother of 4 worth versus a single bachelor, a grandparent versus a student? We can see that the welfare system today doesn't work to solve inequality, but exacerbates it. It creates a system of means testing and evaluating each person to find out if they are worthy of accepting that aid. It creates a bureaucratic class of people who have the authority to determine whether or not somebody is able to receive what they need in a society based on their personal judgment. Whether or not this person is able to be productive, how productive, and how much the society is willing to give them. This is charity, not solidarity or mutual aid.
Which, again, I find a bit ironic, since this is essentially going to be the same as Kropotkin's group contracts. There's still the same authority inherent to the communist anarchist society, assuming the individual isn't coerced into giving up the products of their labor, which is one of the most fundamental freedoms a person can have. The idea that mutualism is inherently ableist is a common bludgeon communists like to cudgel us with, so I think it deserves special attention. I think the communists who repeat this argument don't know that mutualists were advocating for mutual aid decades before Kropotkin ever put pen to paper for the book of the same title. Mutual aid is not at all incongruent with mutualism. I mean, mutual is in the name after all. From reciprocity, all the institutions of mutualism are formed. Mutual insurance, mutual credit, mutual aid, mutual education, reciprocal guarantees of job opportunities and markets, of exchange, of labor, of the good quality and fair pricing of goods, etc. Given that mutual aid societies were able to provide social services to those in need in the past, within a capitalist superstructure no less, I find no reason why mutual aid can't develop in a free economy to satisfy the needs of the community. The original fraternal societies, before they were extinguished in the United States through legislation, were the fundamental forms of self-help for the working class. The biggest limitations of the fraternal societies were their lack of funding, which would become substantially available as wages rose to their full product under mutualism. I also find the characterization of these systems as charity, not solidarity, to be presumptuous. According to Dean Spade's piece, Solidarity, Not Charity, which was a centerpiece in Re-Education's own video on mutual aid, these kinds of voluntary welfare societies among producers are not going to be charity, and they will be more aptly understood as solidarity. Not even to mention, solidarity as a value is something mutualists hold dear, including myself. Charity, aid, relief, and services are terms used in various contexts to denote the provision of support for survival to poor people where the support is governed by rich people and/or the government. There are indeed many negatives to these kinds of models that Spade lists in his essay, and as Re-Education rightly points out, yet given that a mutualist economy will have a tendency towards equality with economic progress, there will be no Mr. Moneybags philanthropist to give charity. Extreme amounts of wealth are going to be hard to accumulate and maintain in a mutualist economy. Likewise, it would be self-explanatory that the government and state wouldn't exist as well. Therefore, the types of bottom-up voluntary welfare societies that would arise to serve the needs of the community are going to take the character of mutual aid and not charity. There's no bureaucracy needed for people to directly serve the needs of their communities, and in no way is this incompatible with market socialism or any tenets of mutualism. Re-education finishes off his critique by painting mutualists as recreating the government state, which I might add is a pretty lazy way to critique an anarchist if you don't properly ground it out first. Aaron then proceeds to fire a number of questionably relevant questions.
Another question is, if a system is based around commodity production and personal enrichment rather than mutual aid and well-being for all, people will try to game that system to achieve personal enrichment at the expense of mutual aid. What prevents the theft of labor credits? What prevents coercion or dirty dealing from acquiring more? What prevents the man who requires less labor credits to live from giving some of his labor credits to another man in exchange for favors? What prevents a cooperative with an abundance of labor credits from exchanging it for foreign currency and using it to hire employees in other countries? What prevents an entire industry from withholding a necessary good or service from the rest of the population in exchange for their servility?
Having dispensed with the notion that mutualists don't advocate for mutual aid, or that mutual aid is mutually exclusive with exchange, the first criticism becomes moot. Mutual exchanges are another means of satisfying needs alongside mutual aid. On the topic of theft and most crimes, I am in accord with re-education from his own video, Law and Order, in that most crimes are done due to socio-economic factors that would have a tendency to diminish under anarchy. Wealth inequality and absolute poverty, after all, are the chief causes of vice and crime. More equitable access to mental health services would also contribute to diminishing criminality. And I should mention that when I speak of crime, it should be understood as antisocial or invasive behavior. Individuals may engage in self-defense or, when it is necessary, call upon a voluntary association to ensure the security of persons and property. Mutual insurances can secure against property that is otherwise stolen or lost. For coercion or dirty dealing, I assume what Aaron is trying to get at is swindling, scams, and other forms of fraud. I believe these forms of vice are also engendered chiefly by the polarization of wealth and governmentalist support and legitimation of these activities in the status quo. The boycott, social ostracism, and other forms of passive resistance serve well to disincentivize criminality of this lesser sort to make it not much of a significant issue. I don't expect bad behaviors to cease in anarchy, but the main sources of such would not exist in an anarchist society. If Aaron is concerned about counterfeit, then mutual banks may federate and consequently develop techniques of manufacture to secure their currencies against counterfeit. What is underlying much of these points brought up by Aaron is about currency falling into the hands of non-laborers, which inequalities will always exist in any economic system with economic rents and whatnot, and do not pose a significant problem. Benjamin Tucker said it best when he wrote, "How are we to remove the injustice of allowing one man to enjoy what another has earned? I do not expect it ever to be removed altogether, but I believe that for every dollar that would be enjoyed by tax dodgers under anarchy, $1,000 would now be enjoyed by men who have got possession of earnings of others through special industrial, commercial, and financial privileges granted to them through authority in violation of a free market." This was written in 1890. We can only imagine how much of an improvement it will be compared to the wealth inequality in the modern day. We don't have to let perfection get in the way of good. I do not know what exchange for favors is meant to imply. If Aaron means that people can trade for each other's services and labor, then no duh, that's the point of the currency or the alleged labor credits in the first place. If he means to imply people will exchange money for the services of sex workers, then they would similarly be free to engage in that type of exchange. Some people are just really good at sex and want to work the world's oldest profession. Some people's individual circumstances lead them to want services from such professionals. Sex work isn't going away after the revolution, even if the socio-economic forces that push people to do sex work when they otherwise wouldn't will cease. International commerce also won't be an issue, and there doesn't need to be any prohibition. Proudhon specifically deals with trade between nations in the general idea in Section 5 of the 6th study, showing how free credit in one nation would in turn put pressure on other countries to embrace the same reforms that would emancipate their workforce, and thereby make their own economies non-exploitative. I am not a skilled enough rhetorician to condense his ideas on international trade for this video, so I would suggest reading that section to anyone curious on the matter. Mutual banking, when put into practice, will put into competition the usurious capitalist finance system surrounding it, and consequently will have a tendency to spread and transform the economic landscape around its operation. This is the most you can really ask of any socialist economy, not even concerning it questionable whether the failures of capitalist society are a responsibility mutualists will have to bear. And finally, I am having trouble figuring out in what scenario his last hypothetical would occur, everyone being equally free. If one set of producers attempts to price a good above its necessary cost, it would signal other producers to engage in this activity and undercut the first set. Trade secrets that may grant advantage to some producers in this respect don't tend to last very long and therefore won't have an effect on the long-term pricing of commodities, especially with the free circulation of information under anarchy. Intellectual property, which upholds much of what is being criticized, especially as it relates to medicine, isn't something that is defended by mutualists and cannot be enforced without a government state, or at least some form of government. The only way this type of scenario could occur is if these goods are not dependent on labor for their exchange value, as it would be impossible to reproduce these goods by competitors. This is an issue principally for natural wealth, the land, which mutualists generally make sure to note that the appropriation and ownership of such necessary and intrinsically scarce goods ought to be limited by bona fide occupancy and use. People would therefore have equal freedom to appropriate portions of the natural wealth for their own personal use. Anyhow, the answer that re-education deduces, which must be the answer to all these questions, is a state. Not just any state, but one just as authoritarian as well.
In one word, a state. And not just any state. One just as strong and just as authoritative as the one we currently have. And in my opinion, one that is just as open to corruption and hierarchy. You need a state to institute laws that enforce property ownership. You need a state to hire police to uphold those laws through violence. You need a state to bureaucratically determine who is worthy of the necessities of life and who isn't. You need a state to dole out that welfare. You need a state to prevent the people from acquiring the goods and services they need to live and enjoy life without working the necessary number of hours to get them. Like I said 1,000 times before, I don't think that we can abolish states through the use of a state.
The forms of property mutualists advocate for don't require a state, as opposed to absentee ownership, which is something that requires an externalized authority to maintain, or property used to subjugate and exploit others. Bottom-up defense associations formed on a non-compulsory basis will be able to protect persons and property without a state just fine. Although the main impetus for such invasions would be lacking in a mutualist society, it would face a permanent trend towards annihilation. Therefore, police abolition is going to be a pretty mainstream opinion within mutualism, as the forms of ownership defended by mutualists don't require enforcement from a government state. Proudhon himself said that, "In place of police, we will put identity of interests." Likewise, there are no anarcho laws advocated by mutualists that require an anarcho-government, and neither has re-education illustrated the necessity for a bureaucratic class that doles out that welfare. Mutualists advocate for similar bottom-up mutual aid that anarchist communists do. Neither do mutualists want to prevent anyone from acquiring goods and services without working. What mutualists maintain is the freedom of exchange and freedom to anyone on how they commit their labor or the disposition of its products. Finally, re-education ends his video with the big point.
If we take Proudhon's mutualist ideas to their logical conclusions, which again I don't think we are necessarily meant to do, then we would eventually necessitate the formulation of a state to maintain the ownership and possession of the means of production as well as the commodities produced in the hands of an elite class. It's my opinion that these reforms would inevitably lead us right back to capitalism.
Which has not been shown in his video. Free competition, the gratuity of credit, and equitable access to land all secure the laborer their independence and their freedom to dispose of their labor and their product as they please. The tendency of the market would be for production for use in the circulation of resources as opposed to the accumulation of profits. There would be no elite class who controls the means of production, the access to which becomes free with mutual banking. Neither has re-education demonstrated the need for a government state in personal ownership. And that is my defense of mutualism. Hopefully my response has served as a useful tool to rectify some of the misunderstandings re-education has spread in his video on mutualism. I am actually a bit surprised since re-education has been very cordial in lending the script of his video to me and appeared hopeful for criticism, so much so that I am curious why he didn't have a similar enthusiasm to engage much if at all with the primary literature on mutualism for a proper video. Secondly, hopefully I've gotten him and other communists to rethink some of their objections to a mutualist economy. Thank you for watching my video on mutualism. If you want to support my YouTube project, pretty please with sugar on top, subscribe to my channel.